It is minus 20 degrees Celsius. The wind is coming from the north, and it has been coming from the north for 3 days straight, which means it has had approximately 1,000 kilometers of open frozen steppe to pick up speed before it hits your face. The sky is the color of old bone. The snow on the ground is not the soft, romantic snow of greeting cards and holiday films. It is hard-packed, wind-scoured, crystalline, and it squeaks under your feet like something complaining. Every breath you take pulls air so cold it feels like inhaling broken glass. And when you exhale, the moisture freezes in the hair around your face before it has time to disperse. You have been outside for 4 hours. You do not have a Gore-Tex jacket. You do not have thermal base layers or hand warmers or insulated boots with a temperature rating stamped on the sole. You do not have a car to get back into, a heated building 50 meters away, or a phone to check the forecast for tomorrow. What you have is what you made, what you knew, and what the people around you helped you build and maintain over the course of a summer and autumn that now feel like a different world entirely. And you are not dying, not even close. Because ancient humans, our actual ancestors, people who were in every neurological and cognitive sense identical to you and me, lived in exactly this kind of cold, not as an occasional crisis, but as a recurring, expected, manageable feature of their lives. They did it for tens of thousands of years, across some of the harshest winter landscapes on Earth, without a single piece of modern cold weather technology. And they didn't just survive. They hunted in it. They traveled in it. They had children in it. They made art in it. They built communities that lasted generations in it. How? That is exactly what we're going to find out today. And I promise you, the answer is not they just got used to it. The answer is a layered, sophisticated, deeply human story about technology, knowledge, community, and the extraordinary capacity of an intelligent social species to engineer solutions to problems that should, by any purely biological measure, have killed them centuries before they ever got the chance to become us. Let's start with the cold, hard truth about human biology, because understanding what ancient humans were working against is essential to appreciating what they actually accomplished. Humans are, from a purely physiological standpoint, tropical animals. Our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, are all confined to tropical and subtropical environments. Our body hair is minimal to the point of being basically decorative. Our subcutaneous fat layer, while variable, is thin compared to cold-adapted mammals like seals, walruses, or even domesticated pigs. We have no seasonal fur change. We have no ability to hibernate or enter a metabolic state that reduces our heat requirements during cold periods. Our core body temperature needs to stay within a remarkably narrow range to maintain normal function. At a core temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, just 2 degrees below normal, the first symptoms of hypothermia begin: shivering, confusion, loss of fine motor coordination. At 32 degrees, you lose the ability to think clearly or make good decisions. At 28 degrees, the heart begins to fail. At somewhere around 20 degrees, you die. The cold does not give you time to learn. Drop an unprotected modern human into the conditions I described in the opening, minus 20, wind, exposed, and you are looking at potentially fatal hypothermia in under an hour depending on the conditions. Less if the person is wet, less if they're already calorie depleted, less if the wind is strong, and yet ancient humans were living in these conditions, not surviving a single bad night. Living there, seasonally, repeatedly, year after year. The archaeological record from sites in Siberia, in Central Europe during glacial periods, in the high latitudes of northern Asia, tells us unambiguously that ancient humans were present in environments with winter temperatures regularly reaching minus 20, minus 30, and in some locations even colder. The gap between human biological cold tolerance and the environments ancient humans actually inhabited is the space that technology, knowledge, and social organization filled. And filling that gap was arguably the most impressive engineering achievement in all of ancient human history. Let's start with fire, because fire is the foundation that everything else rests on. We have evidence of controlled fire use by ancient humans going back at least 1 million years at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, and there are suggestive indicators pushing that date back further, possibly to 1.5 million years or beyond. By the time ancient humans were pushing into the cold northern latitudes of Europe and Asia, fire was not a new technology. It was a deeply embedded, culturally sophisticated practice with hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge behind it. But fire in a cold climate winter context is a different challenge than fire in a temperate environment. Building and maintaining a fire when your fuel sources are covered in snow, when the wind is working against every flame you coax into existence, when the temperature is cold enough to make your fingers clumsy and slow on the very materials you need to manipulate. That is a genuine skill set. One that had to be learned, practiced, and transmitted across generations with precision. Ancient cold climate firemaking required knowledge of fuel sources, which woods burn hot and long, which burn fast and bright, which produce excessive smoke, which can be gathered in winter when surface wood is frozen, and what to do when they can't be. It required knowledge of fire structure. How to build a fire that maintains itself in wind, how to bank a fire for overnight heat with minimum fuel consumption, how to restart a fire quickly from preserved coals in the morning when the temperature is at its lowest and your body's caloric reserves are most depleted. It required knowledge of fire placement, where to build a fire inside a shelter for maximum heat distribution and minimum smoke accumulation, how to position bodies around a fire to maximize shared warmth, how to use radiant heat reflected off rock walls to double the effective warmth of a fire of a given size. This is not casual knowledge. This is a technical curriculum, and it was passed down through direct demonstration, through storytelling, through the kind of patient, repeated instruction that transforms observation into competence across generations of ancient humans living in cold environments. There's also the matter of fire-starting technology itself. In cold conditions, the standard friction-based fire-starting methods, bow drill, hand drill, become significantly harder. Cold, numb fingers have reduced sensitivity and strength. Wood that has absorbed moisture from snow is harder to work with. Ancient humans in cold climates almost certainly developed strategies to manage these challenges, keeping fire-starting materials dry and warm against the body, maintaining coals or embers through the night rather than letting fires go fully cold, using preserved embers carried in containers made of bone or clay or bark to start new fires rather than having to generate a spark from scratch every time. The management of fire continuity, keeping at least some fire alive through the winter, never letting your group reach a state of no fire, was almost certainly a critical cultural priority in ancient cold climate communities. Fire was not a convenience, it was a lifeline, and maintaining it was a responsibility that the entire group shared. Now let's talk about shelter, because shelter is the second pillar of cold climate survival. And ancient humans built it with a sophistication that consistently surprises people who haven't looked closely at the evidence. The image of ancient humans huddling in natural caves is not wrong. Caves were absolutely used as shelter, and some cave sites in Europe and Asia show evidence of continuous or repeated ancient human occupation across thousands of years. But caves have significant limitations. They're not uniformly distributed across the landscape. They can be damp and cold, depending on their orientation and depth. And in the open steppe environments of Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe, the mammoth steppe that ancient humans occupied during some of the coldest periods of the last glacial, there simply aren't many caves. The landscape is flat, the geology is sedimentary, and you cannot shelter in a cave that doesn't exist. So ancient humans built. The most remarkable cold climate shelters in the ancient archaeological record come from sites in Ukraine and Russia, dating to between 15,000 and 25,000 years. Ago, during the depths of the last glacial maximum. At sites like Mezhyrish and Mezin in Ukraine, archaeologists have found the remains of structures built from mammoth bones. Dozens of mammoth bones, carefully arranged to form circular or oval foundations up to 8 meters in diameter, with post holes indicating the positions of wooden or bone supports for a roof structure. These were not accidental accumulations, these were deliberately designed, engineered structures. The builders selected specific bones for specific structural roles. Mammoth skulls and pelvises for the foundation, long bones for uprights, tusks for roof arches. The construction required planning, coordination, and a working knowledge of structural mechanics, understanding which configurations would bear weight, which arrangements would be stable in wind, how to create a watertight roof using available materials. The mammoth bone houses at Mezhyrish used an estimated 149 mammoth individuals worth of bones across 4 structures at the site. That is not a small undertaking. That is an organized, sustained, community-scale construction project. And these structures were occupied repeatedly over extended periods. The evidence of hearths, tool-making debris, and food remains suggests that groups returned to these sites winter after winter, maintaining and possibly rebuilding the structures as needed. Inside these structures, with a fire burning and multiple bodies generating heat, the temperature would have been dramatically higher than the outside air. The thermal mass of the bone walls, combined with an insulating outer covering of hide and possibly sod, or earth, would have maintained interior warmth even through the night when the fire burned low. These were not crude windbreaks, they were engineered thermal environments. In forested regions, ancient humans used different materials. Wooden post structures covered in bark and hide, excavated into the earth to take advantage of the ground's thermal insulation, sometimes built in south-facing positions on hillsides to maximize solar gain during the short winter days. The specific form varied by location and available materials. The underlying principle was the same. Create a bounded, insulated space that retains body heat and fire heat against the assault of the cold outside. Let's talk about clothing in the cold climate context specifically, because winter clothing for survival in extreme cold is not just clothing, it is a life support system. We've established in other discussions that ancient humans were making and wearing clothing going back at least 100,000 years and probably much longer. But cold climate winter clothing is a specific technological challenge that goes well beyond basic hide garments. Effective insulation against extreme cold requires layering, not because someone decided layering was a good fashion choice, but because layered clothing traps air between the layers, and trapped, still air is one of the most effective insulators known. The same principle underlies modern, high-performance cold weather clothing. The base layer wicks moisture, the mid-layer traps air. The outer layer blocks wind and precipitation. Ancient humans arrived at a functionally equivalent system through observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge. The furs of different animals have dramatically different insulating properties, and ancient humans knew this in practical detail. Reindeer fur has a unique cellular structure. The individual hairs are hollow, that makes it exceptionally lightweight for its insulating value. It was used extensively by ancient cold climate peoples for exactly this reason. Wolverine fur has properties that prevent moisture condensation and ice buildup around the face and hood opening, which is why wolverine fur is still used for this purpose in modern Arctic clothing. Fox and hare fur is less durable, but provides excellent insulation for extremities. The specific animals hunted in a cold climate environment were hunted not only for meat, but for the specific insulating properties of their pelts. Selected and combined according to a sophisticated functional taxonomy that modern materials science has largely confirmed was correct. Footwear is a specific cold climate survival challenge that deserves particular attention. Feet are one of the most vulnerable points in cold weather survival. They are far from the body's core, they bear the body's weight. They are in contact with cold ground, and they are prone to sweating during exertion, which creates moisture that dramatically reduces insulating effectiveness and can cause frostbite even at moderate cold temperatures. Getting cold footwear wrong in conditions of severe winter cold can result in the loss of toes or feet. Injuries that in the ancient world were often ultimately fatal. Archaeological evidence from multiple ancient cold climate sites, combined with the technological practices of indigenous Arctic and subarctic peoples studied in ethnographic contexts, paints a picture of ancient footwear that was carefully engineered for its purpose. Multiple layers of hide, sometimes including a moisture-absorbing inner layer of dry grass or plant fiber, which was and still is used in traditional cold climate footwear because it wicks moisture away from the skin. An insulating middle layer, and a durable outer sole, sewn with the finest possible stitches using the bone needles we find at ancient sites, because every small gap in the seam is a point where cold air enters and warm air escapes. The ancient bone needles we find at cold climate sites, some of them extraordinarily fine, barely 2 millimeters in diameter, were not making rough garments. They were making precisely tailored, closely fitted clothing where the quality of the seam was as functionally critical as the quality of the material. Now let's talk about food in winter, because warmth without calories is a temporary solution at best. The human body's primary defense against cold is thermogenesis, the generation of metabolic heat. Shivering is the involuntary version, Muscles contract rapidly to generate heat at the cost of enormous caloric expenditure. But the body also generates heat through non-shivering thermogenesis, primarily driven by brown adipose tissue. And the fuel for all of this heat generation is calories. Specifically, in cold conditions, fat calories. In the cold, your caloric needs increase dramatically. A person doing moderate physical activity in extreme cold may need 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day, roughly double what a modern sedentary person requires. And those calories need to be predominantly fat because fat provides more than twice the caloric density of carbohydrates or protein and is the most efficient fuel for thermogenesis. Ancient cold climate humans ate accordingly. The faunal evidence from cold climate ancient sites, the bones, the butchery marks, the patterns of which parts of animals were processed and consumed, consistently shows a strong emphasis on fat-rich foods. Bone marrow, which is extremely high in fat and calories, was systematically extracted from large animal bones at virtually every cold climate site. The bones were cracked with stone tools, the marrow scooped out, and it was consumed directly or rendered into fat for cooking or storage. Brain, which is also fat-rich, was consumed. Organ meats, which are calorie-dense and nutrient-rich compared to muscle meat, were prioritized. The specific animals hunted in cold climate environments were also selected in part for their fat content at different times of year. Autumn was the critical harvesting season. Animals that had spent the summer grazing and building fat reserves for winter were hunted intensively, and their fat was stored for the cold months ahead. The fat of cold climate animals like reindeer, mammoth, and woolly rhinoceros was not just food. It was also fuel for lamps, stone vessels filled with animal fat and lit with a wick of plant fiber, providing both light and supplemental heat in enclosed shelters during the long winter nights. The fat lamp is one of the most elegant technologies in the ancient cold climate toolkit. It burns cleanly enough to use indoors. It provides sustained light that extends the productive hours of the day beyond the brief winter daylight. It provides localized warmth. And it can be fueled with the same resource, animal fat, that the group is already managing for food purposes. One resource, multiple critical functions. Let's talk about knowledge systems, because the technical information required to survive a northern winter is so complex and so specific that it could only be maintained and transmitted through robust cultural systems. You cannot figure out how to survive in minus 30-degree conditions from scratch. Not in a single lifetime. Not even close. The knowledge required. Which animals carry the best winter fur? When to harvest them, how to process the hides before they freeze, which plants insulate better than others for footwear, how to read weather signs in the sky and the behavior of animals that predict incoming storms, how to find and follow game trails in snow, how to navigate in whiteout conditions, how to prevent and treat frostbite and hypothermia. That knowledge is not discoverable by individual trial and error. People die in the process of learning it that way. The knowledge exists in communities. It is accumulated over generations of careful observation, transmitted through explicit instruction, embedded in stories and practices and ritual behaviors that encode survival information in memorable, transmissible forms. Ancient cold climate communities were, among other things, knowledge management systems. Their primary asset was not their tools or their shelters or their clothing, all of which could be remade, but the accumulated knowledge stored in the minds of their most experienced members and transmitted to the next generation through every available channel. This is why the death of an elderly, experienced community member was such a significant event in ancient communities. Not just emotionally, but practically. An elder who had survived 50 winters in the northern steppe carried an irreplaceable archive of survival knowledge. They knew things that no one else knew. They had seen conditions that the younger members of the group had not yet encountered. Their experience was a resource that could not be quickly replaced, and its loss made the entire community more vulnerable. The respect and care extended to elders in virtually every traditional culture on Earth is not merely sentimental. It is at least partly a rational response to the survival value of accumulated knowledge. A value that would have been most acute in the most demanding and unforgiving environments, like the deep winter cold of the glacial northern latitudes. Let's talk about the social dimension of cold climate survival, because this is the part that ties everything else together. Individual humans, no matter how skilled, do not survive northern winters alone. The mathematics of caloric requirements, the physical demands of maintaining shelter and fire, the vulnerability of sleep, the specific risks of solo travel in cold conditions, all of it points to the same conclusion. Winter survival in extreme cold is a fundamentally collective undertaking. The winter aggregations documented at ancient cold climate sites, where evidence suggests multiple family groups came together in larger, more permanent camps during the coldest months, were not random social gatherings. They were strategic survival responses. Larger groups generate more collective body heat. Larger groups can maintain continuous fire watch through the night, with individuals rotating through sleep and wakefulness so that the fire never goes untended, and someone is always alert to changing weather or approaching danger. Larger groups can share the labor of winter hunting, the exhausting, technically demanding work of tracking and pursuing large prey through deep snow. Larger groups can distribute the catastrophic risk of a local food failure. If the reindeer herd doesn't come through this valley this winter, a small isolated group starves. A larger group with connections to multiple territories has options. The winter camp was also the social engine of ancient cold climate culture. The long, dark, cold evenings, when travel was impossible and the group was confined to the shelter, were the context for the storytelling, the music, the transmission of knowledge, the maintenance of relationships, the resolution of conflicts, and the ritual practices that held the community together as a functioning social unit. Winter was not just a survival challenge, it was a cultural season, the time when the accumulated knowledge and creativity of the community turned inward and expressed itself most intensely. The cave art of southern France and northern Spain, much of it made during winter months based on the evidence of seasonal indicators in the archaeological layers, is perhaps the most spectacular expression of this winter cultural intensity. When you couldn't hunt because the weather was too severe, when the days were brutally short, when the group was confined together in firelit spaces, people made art. Extraordinary art by any standard. Art that has survived 30,000 to 40,000 years and still stops modern viewers in their tracks.